Good evening, everyone. Welcome to a People's Tour of Boston. I'm Catherine Allgore, and I'm the president here at the MHS. And I don't know what it's doing where you are, but here in the greater Boston area, it's just gray and cold and rainy. It's the perfect day to grab an Afghan, and a cup of tea, and a cat, and curl up on the sofa with a lovely, cozy website. And honestly, you couldn't get a better one than ours as far as informing and entertaining. So we're at masshist.org. And when you go on the website, you can see all kinds of things to do actually on the website, but also lists of our events. I always think the blog is a nice way to get to know us. It's our very talented staff and their writing. So apparently it's Archives Month, and we're talking about that. But there's also stories about things in our collections. And one of my current favorites is written by one of our Adams family papers staff members, Gwen Fries, where she tries to live like John Quincy Adams for a week. It goes well, but there were a lot of cold showers and getting up early and reading very, very big books. So very interesting. But you'll see that we're in the middle of our conference. We have our very first online exhibition. Our gala is coming, and you can buy tickets and read about John Meacham and Emily Rooney. And you may be looking at all of this and you're thinking, oh my God, I didn't know about any of this. And there's just too much to do. And how do I sort it through? And the answer is way down at the bottom of the homepage. You can join our mailing list. And we will send you every week a beautifully designed little, picture postcard with an inspirational quote and a picture of the Historical Society and a list of what's going on that week so it can help you plan. And I would not be doing my job as president if I didn't also say you can also go up to the website where it says support and click on that. And there's ways there for you to make a gift to keep all of this stuff that we give away for free. But better yet, become a member and join our community. We'd love to have you. So without further ado, and I just said to our panel presenters, I'm so glad that for this tour, we could all just stay indoors. I'm just going to toss it to my colleague, Gavin Cleespies. Gavin?
Great. Thank you very much, Catherine. And I'd like to welcome everyone to our online program today. I would like to extend a special welcome to anyone who might be joining an MHS program for the first time. If you're not familiar with MHS, we are the oldest historical society in America and have been collecting, preserving, publishing, and sharing our history since 1791. We hold an amazing collection of close to 14 million manuscript pages, including the papers of 3 of the first 6 US presidents. Due to the ongoing pandemic, we have taken to hosting both virtual events and online exhibition. I would also encourage everyone to check out our recently launched exhibition, which is called Who Counts? A Look at Voter Rights Through Political Cartoons. This is a great show, which also includes a subsection with a biography of Thomas Nast, the legendary first political cartoonist in American history. To complement this online exhibition, we have a series of programs that are coming up. And this Thursday evening, we'll be hosting historian Fiona Halloran and award-winning cartoonist Pat Bagley, who will be speaking on the life of Thomas Nast. Nast was a pioneer in American political cartoons. He created the Republican elephant, the Democratic donkey, and popularized the depictions of Santa Claus. But while he helped to create the modern American visual culture, he also presented conflicting and sometimes disturbing depictions of African Americans. So these 2 experts will help us better understand Nast and his legacy. Not this Friday, but next Friday, we'll be hosting a virtual gallery tour with our curator, Peter Drumming. Information on all of these programs is available on our website, masshist.org. We have a very special event for us this evening. We'll explore parts of Boston you may not know. We are joined by the 3 authors of A People's Guide to Greater Boston. This new book reveals the region's richness and vibrancy in ways that are neglected by traditional area guidebooks and obscured by many tourist destinations. The guide takes readers to sites of oppression, resistance, organizing, transformation in Boston and the outlying neighborhoods and municipalities. Our 3 speakers are Joseph Nevins, who was born in Dorchester and today is a professor of geography at Vassar College. Suren Moodliar, who is a resident of Chelsea and is both the coordinator of Encounter 5, a movement building space in downtown Boston, and an editor of the Journal of Socialism and Democracy. And Eleni Macrakis, who grew up in Cambridge and now works in the field of affordable housing development in the greater Boston area. She holds a master's in urban planning from Harvard University. So without further ado, I'm happy to turn it over to our speakers this evening.
You know, after 6 years of extremely pleasant and productive work in which we learned inspiring stories, we imagined presenting our book to the subject of our title, namely the people. Of course, history interrupts the best laid plans, frustrating our ambitions and forcing us to pay attention to the problems that the powerful ignore, set aside, or repress. As such, A People's Guide to Greater Boston is as much about the present and about the past and how they speak to one another so that we may create a future that corresponds to the interests of the people. The starting points for our book are global. For example, today's New York Times warns that the world's largest tropical wetland in Brazil has become an inferno. Yet another starting point for our book about Boston could be the present moment of global rebellion. Why these starting points? That's because our city and our book about our city looks at how Boston has shaped the world and is shaped by it. So if we think about climate breakdown as signaled by the fires in central Brazil, we have to think about our city's contribution to global warming, not only in terms of CO2 emissions, but also its intellectual role in establishing the global economy and its practical role in establishing the same. If we are to think about the present rebellion, broad and intersectional as it is, we have to think about this city's founding as a republic of race and capital. Indeed, before our city came to be, one of its founders, John Winthrop, made practical plans while still anchored in England. He sought to integrate the future colony into an emerging world economy, one that would also invent a global racial and class structure. But our city is also home to David Walker, who would challenge those structures from his home in Boston on Beacon Hill. He accepted the prospect of violence to challenge a violent system. He also turned for inspiration to the then recent history of the Haitian Revolution as part of a long revolution against slavery. As a result, in Boston, we can also claim then some of the roots to a future Pan-Africanism and human rights doctrine. And if we are appalled at our city's role in war making, say Raytheon and the maiming of children in Yemen, Boston can also claim to be the birthplace of peace movements, from Anne Hutchinson's activism in the 1630s through to mass peace action today, challenging the aforementioned corporation. We would like you to be able to use this book in ways to connect these different kinds of issues. As such, we've presented to you the city at a street level in which we encounter sights and experiences from many different periods and with many different global connections, all at the same time. As you can see from our observations, we have a book that is very wide-ranging with huge ambition. It will be helpful for Eleni Macrakis, my co-author, to say a few words about how we have structured this ambition across 312 pages. Eleni?
Thanks, Suren. Our book is organized spatially, as guidebooks tend to do. We hope that this allows an experience of the city through walking, biking, or taking public transportation, like we did when we were researching this book. The book starts with 14 groupings of Boston neighborhoods. We group them geographically, starting with the Boston Harbor and the Shawmut Peninsula, then move on to other neighborhoods such as Roxbury and Mission Hill, Charlestown, Dorchester, Mattapan and Hyde Park, and Allston and Brighton, for example. We then take you to adjacent towns and cities such as Cambridge, Somerville, and Chelsea, further west to Concord and Waltham, north to cities like Lynn, Newburyport, and Lawrence, and lastly south to the South Shore. We also have 6 thematic tours, including a Malcolm and Martin tour, with sites in and around Boston associated with Malcolm X and Dr. Martin Luther King during their time in Boston. We have a Sacco and Vanzetti tour that details the lives of 2 Boston area immigrants whose political activism and later arrest inspired local, domestic, and international protests. The Sacco and Vanzetti tour takes the reader south of the city to Plymouth and Brockton, where they worked and organized, and to sites around the city of Boston associated with their arrest, execution, and funeral. The book also includes a 1% tour that highlights past and current companies and organizations and individuals that exemplify the accumulation of wealth, power, and political influence that have greatly contributed to the regional inequities of past, present, and future. We explore sites such as Faneuil Hall, the United Fruit Company, Bain Capital, and the Harvard Business School. Now, Joe will speak a little bit more about the feeling of the book.
All right, sorry about the technological difficulties. Thank you, Eleni. As the title of the book suggests, it's literally a guidebook. It's one that's organized around particular sites. At the same time, it's a lot more than a guidebook in that we seek to tell a story, one about Greater Boston's historical geography. So in addition to focusing on particular sites, City of Boston neighborhoods, and various municipalities around the city, the book tells a story about the making of Greater Boston as a region. And what we mean by this, by a region, is that it's an area that shares a lot, it's characterized by strong ties within, and lots of divisions as well. We explore these ties and divisions, how they were made, challenged, and struggled over, as a way of trying to make sense of what Boston was and is. Our approach in the book is explicitly one from below, right? From the political, economic, social, and ideological margins. And we're calling this a perspective of the people. A people's perspective privileges the desires and hopes, struggles of those on the receiving ends of unjust forms of power, and those who work to challenge such inequities and to realize an egalitarian Greater Boston. In this regard, the book's about the past, present, and future. And when I say the future, what we mean by that is that we hope that we can all take inspiration and instruction from those who have preceded us and those who struggle today to create a Greater Boston and the larger world that it reflects and helps to make, that's radically inclusive and democratic, and that centers equality and social and environmental justice. To tell the story we do, over 400 years, we had to make choices, hard choices about what to include and what not to include. And what we'll do tonight is give you a sense of what we do in the book by each of us focusing on different times and places. And we'll start with Suren.
Thanks, Joe. So I'm going to start with the 1840s, essentially the period leading up to the Civil War. It was a period where, and in framing it as the period leading up to the Civil War, I am privileging the struggle against slavery, but it was also a time of many other movements that were broad and intersectional. For slavery and for the challenges of the movements of the time, one has to think about the central challenge for people living in Massachusetts, which was, if you were opposed to slavery, how do you win over people whose livelihoods were connected to slavery and the racial capitalism of the day? After all, many of the inputs for the mills that drove the Industrial Revolution in Massachusetts depended on cotton from the enslaved South. So I'd like to tell this story by turning to a particular site. This is 26 Court Street. And here, as we do throughout the book, we tie particular sites to stories that we think help us understand a little bit about the place, but also about the struggles surrounding not only the site, but the people of that period. In that sense, it's an historical geography. The story that I'd like to tell about Courthouse Square or 26 Court Street is the one of the Latimers. In early October 1842, Rebecca Latimer, then pregnant, and her husband George fled Virginia and slavery, arriving in Boston several days later via Baltimore and Philadelphia. On arrival, however, George was recognized by a former employee of a James Gray. James Gray was George Latimer's enslaver in Virginia. George was detained and charged with larceny. Larceny, namely the theft of property. What was the property? His own body. As word spread about Latimer's arrest, members of the African American community attempted to unsuccessfully free Latimer through direct action. A lawyer, Samuel Edmund Sewell, won a hearing before a judge that required Latimer's appearance at the court. So this was 26 Court Street in the period. And in requiring Latimer's appearance before court, he actually won a small victory. The alternative was summary deportation back to slavery in the South. Newspapers of the day, including Garrison's Liberator, discussed the issues, including the contradiction between federal and state laws. But a broad and vibrant movement emerged around Latimer's fate. In fact, noting the mood in the city, one observer wrote, "Boston was without doubt the most potentially violent city in America. Community meetings were organized, petitions written. The African American New England Freedom Association was organized with backup plans to spirit Latimer away in case the court case went against him." There was what the historian Manisha Sinha describes as unprecedented cooperation between the Garrisonians and other abolitionists. The case unified the movement. Okay. A Latimer committee was launched together with a short-lived newspaper, the Latimer and North Star Journal. It came out every other day during his imprisonment and in the days after that. It reported that fire and bloodshed threatened in every direction. Eventually, as the courthouse proceedings went against Latimer, his freedom, and together with that of Rebecca's, was purchased using funds that were raised during the meetings called Latimer meetings, and these meetings spun up all over Eastern Massachusetts. The multiracial mobilizations also produced several petitions, including one of 64,000 signatures. It was called the Great Massachusetts Petition, calling on the state to forbid the use of its property, jails, and employees for the rendition of enslaved individuals. John Quincy Adams used another petition gathered in this period, this time with 51,000 signatures, to call on Massachusetts to repeal the fugitive slave law. To provide you with some context for the scale of the mobilization and these petitions, the population of Boston at the time was around 90,000 people. So you have a sense of the mobilization that occurred. I'll say a little bit more about how this case plays out then. So in addition to the wave of activism that coincided with the shifting public opinion between the North and South, a series of Latimer or personal liberty laws were enacted, not only in Massachusetts, but in other states in the North, requiring that due process take place before anyone is rendered to the South. As you can see then, the Latimer case proved to be a decisive moment in the history of anti-slavery, one that would polarize North and South and set the conditions for the Civil War. And of course, as we know, there's at least over slavery, but not racism itself, the issues were largely resolved by the Civil War, created by the political context that the Latimer case and other cases like it would create. In terms of the personal dimensions to the story, the Latimers would go on to live out their lives in Chelsea and Lynn, Massachusetts, and they remained part of the broad abolitionist movement. In Lynn, for example, they were friends with the Hutchinson family singers, who are a vital part of the national abolitionist movement and whom we also write about in our sections on Lynn. Their youngest son, Lewis Latimer, was born in Chelsea in 1848, and he would go on to be a successful engineer of some renown. As a result, we see how these local events, and this should be obvious from this description, these local events, these local actions contributed greatly to the national polarization. And as such, we find a mechanism by which movements are able to take action on big, sometimes abstract issues, and use these local actions as leverage to address the larger social question. So one could ask, given that, you know, the Latimer meetings occurred in a number of places, that Latimer was held at the Leverett Circle Jail, or that there were meetings in Faneuil Hall and another place that I'll talk about in a moment. Why did we choose 26 Court Street to cite this particular story? Well, the courthouse itself was not only the site of dramatic actions that brought nearby residents, mainly African American, from Beacon Hill to the steps to protest, but it also signified the clash between federal and local laws, federal and state laws. And as such, this particular site has great resonance then for the greater anti-slavery struggle. And that was part of, that sort of figured into our decision-making to speak about about 26 Court Street. In the next slide, I would like to tell you a little bit about the Marlborough Hotel and Chapel. This is just down the road from Courthouse Square on Washington Street at the corner of Washington and Bromfield. So the place is called the Marlborough Hotel and Chapel. And from 1838 to 1852, it was a place that exemplified free speech. People like Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, and others regularly spoke there, often when they had been denied access to or literally chased out of Faneuil Hall. One of the interesting things about this particular site, and I won't tell any stories about it, we do in the book, is that it really exemplifies how the movement against slavery was part of a broader social mobilization. Indeed, future leaders of the women's movement also met at the Hotel and Chapel. One of the reasons for this is that it was part of a broader movement against the consumption of alcohol. It was also, and this is a different point, a place where the Transcendentalist movement met, as well as a place where the anti-war movement, then against the war in Mexico, or the war against Mexico, the war of 1846 through 1848. As a result, we can see how these movements of the period were not only multiracial, but also multi-issue and possessive of a view of society as something incomplete and necessarily awaiting change. Another sort of fertile period for social change was the period of the 19 teens and 1920s, and Eleni will speak to that. Eleni.
Okay, so now from the 1840s to the year 1919. The American Woolen Company was founded in 1899 by William Wood and his father-in-law, Frederick Eyre, and grew to become the largest employer of textile workers in the 19-teens, including Arlington Mills, the site of the 1919 strike. While the mills themselves were in the city of Lawrence, about 45 minutes north of Boston, the headquarters of the American Woolen Company were located in the old Shawmut Bank building, where One Federal Place stands today, one of the many high-rise buildings around Post Office Square. From the headquarters in downtown Boston, the American Woolen Company became one of the world's leading wool markets. This connection between the concentration of financial and business power in downtown Boston and working class labor organizing like we see in Lawrence and in other places of Greater Boston is a pattern that we talk a lot about in our book. William Wood, the owner of the American Woolen Company, lived in nearby Back Bay at 21 Fairfield Street. Wood was known to be vehemently anti-union, with many of his workers joining unions and organizing for workers' rights, both in the Bread and Roses strike of 1912 and the strike of 1919, which I'll talk more about now. The labor strike of 1919 grew out of a campaign by unions in Lawrence, part of a national and worldwide effort to cut the work week from 54 hours to 48 hours. In fact, there are bumper stickers in Lawrence that remind us to thank union workers in Lawrence for our weekend. Mill owners nationally accepted the demand of reducing the work week, but said they would not raise hourly wages. Conservative leadership of the National United Textile Workers led the majority of these workers nationally to accept this offer. In Lawrence, unionists demanded 54 hours of pay for 48 hours of work. This demand, among other grievances around poor housing, harsh discipline, and discrimination in the workplace, led to the February 3rd, 1919 strike of some 20,000 workers. The strike was characterized by aggressive police violence. On February 26, 1919, police on horseback attacked a picket line of thousands of strikers and their supporters in front of the Arlington Mills. Among the crowd was A.J. Musty, a Christian minister, part of the strike committee, and a famous pacifist. He later played important roles in the civil rights and anti-Vietnam War movements. He had come up from his home in Boston at 99 Appleton Way in the South End. Police clubbed Musty after catching up to him in a nearby alley and arrested him for disturbing the peace and loitering. Thanks to the workers, enough money was raised to pay his bail, and he was back on the picket line the next day. Later in the strike, police escalated their opposition by mounting machine guns at major intersections. The labor movement in Lawrence was strong because of its base, a diverse group of immigrants who came together around a common set of goals. Musty's role was not one of an on-the-ground organizer. There were many skilled workers leading the strike. This impressive organizing likely led them to reach out to prominent out-of-towners like Musty, who could build their support base. The strike lasted more than 3 months, ending on May 20th, when mill owners accepted most of the workers' demands. After several changes in manufacturing ownership, the Arlington Mills building, in this next photo, were converted into majority affordable apartments. 134 out of 137 are affordable under state regulations, with phase 1 complete in 2012 and phase 2 in 2015. The same year, about 4,000 Boston telephone operators went on strike for higher wages and better working conditions. Their workplace was the New England Telephone Company Exchange, which was located in Chinatown at 8 Harrison Avenue. The photo on the right shows a newer building. An older building that was part of the exchange sits behind this one. For those familiar with Chinatown today, the site sits across from the 2017 community designed and painted mural in the photo on the left. The strikers in 1919 were almost all young Irish American women. During the 6-day work stoppage, there was no telephone service in Maine, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Vermont. Historian Stephen Norwood calls this strike probably the most complete response ever to a strike call involving workers across state lines. Almost every telephone worker in 5 of the 6 New England states walked off the job, about 8,000 workers in total. The strikers were part of the first women-led and controlled U.S. trade union, the Telephone Operators Department, a self-governing entity within the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, the IBEW. More than a third of the union's members were in New England, mainly Boston, an outgrowth of the presence in the city of the National Women's Trade Union League. Strikers experienced strong support across the city, from Boston's largely Irish working class and even to the Boston police, who later went on strike, and the city's political leadership. In Chinatown, the site of one of Boston's principal telephone exchanges, neighborhood merchants set up tables behind the building to serve food to the striking workers. Meanwhile, Chinese residents helped to picket the building. Such factors help explain why the telephone operators won the strike and gained substantial pay increases, despite opposition to the labor stoppage from the IBEW's male leadership and the use of strike breakers, many of whom were students from Harvard, MIT, and Tufts. Not far from 8 Harrison Avenue, the Common Cupboard, a restaurant owned by the mother of Rose Sullivan, vice president of the telephone operators department, was a meeting place advertised in a Boston newspaper as a meeting place for radicals, a place where talk is carried on briskly on all sorts of subjects. Theorists of all sorts are free to air their pet ideas. In the words of one FBI agent, the restaurant was a rendezvous for socialists and malcontents of every class, from the dynamite anarchists to the pink tea socialists. Many of the telephone operators union were regulars. It's no coincidence that these two entries are connected. Joe came across the existence of the Common Cupboard when researching the telephone operator strike, but couldn't find an address for the restaurant. We were helped with by a research librarian at the Boston Public Library who did a deep dive into Common Cupboard history and found some connections that led us to knowing the site of the Common Cupboard, the address. The next challenge was finding a photo for the site. If we couldn't find an archival photo of the event or place, we often took a photo of the site ourselves, like with the telephone exchange. But in this case, Common Street no longer exists as a result of urban renewal in the 1960s. We ended up contacting the BPDA, formerly the Boston Redevelopment Authority, or BRA, and we were able to dig up photos from a surveyor's record of the South Cove urban renewal area, and in the end found the one you see here, a marked up photo of 11A Common Street, probably not long before the area was razed during urban renewal. Another strike, later in the fall of 1919, rocked the city of Boston. On September 9th, 1919, 1,100 Boston police officers of 1,500 voted for an immediate strike. The vote was a response to the firing of 19 officers by Boston's police commissioner for organizing a union. After a night of riots, negotiations were underway between the labor leaders and the mayor at the time, Governor Calvin Coolidge. And the mayor at the time. Governor Calvin Coolidge undercut the mayor by seizing control of the police department and firing all the strikers. This reflected the sharp divide between the city and state's Protestant elite and Boston's largely Irish Catholic working class. Today, Boston police officers receive middle-class salaries, many much higher, and like police unions across the country, the Boston Police Patrolmen's Association generally opposes efforts at police reform and accountability and displays little solidarity with the interests of working class people. A different political action also occurred the same year, in the same city, in a place known for its baseball, traffic, home to the last team in Major League Baseball to racially integrate, Fenway Park. This will probably come as a surprise to most of you, but perhaps the largest crowd in Fenway Park's history was not one watching a miraculous comeback or devastating defeat, but a crowd assembled to protest racism, the type inextricably tied to colonialism. On June 30th, 1919, at least 50,000 people, with many more outside the stadium's gates, gathered at Fenway to demand an end to British rule of Ireland. To give a bit of context, this crowd was 3 times larger than the number who had seen the Red Sox and Babe Ruth win the World Series the previous year. Eamon de Valera, president of the Irish Republic, had come to the US to raise money for nationalist forces and to win diplomatic recognition from the US government. After this historic crowd at Fenway, he traveled north to Lawrence, which became the first US city to officially recognize the Republic of Ireland. 1919 in Greater Boston was a year of strikes and working class solidarity, with many sites in our book highlighting this year. Now Joe will take us through the 1970s and other movements and impressive organizations.
Thanks, Eleni. You know, if you ask people around the country what they think of the city of Boston, many will say, as some of you probably know, will say that they think of Boston as a racist city. And one can certainly point to many pieces of evidence to back that up. That's true today, just as it has been in the past. As someone who grew up in Boston during the 1970s and lived through the period of busing and school desegregation and went to Boston public schools, such a characterization resonates with me. Of course, like many many places, like all places, Boston's many things, not just one. And the fact that it is many things means that what it is and what it should be is something that people struggle over, not least in terms of who belongs and who doesn't. City Square in Charlestown was the site of such struggle. The photo on the left is the old Orange Line, right? It's long torn down. Right? The photo on the right is what City Square looks like today. City Square Park is the location of the original Great House, the community meeting house, and the seat of government of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. It was built in 1629. In 1934, hundreds of anti-Nazi protesters gathered in City Square, having marched there from the North End. They were largely trade unionists, Communist Party members, and Jewish community activists. They were opposed by a contingent of pro-Germany students from Harvard who said that they were there to assist the police. Fights broke out and the police attacked the demonstrators, particularly the anti-Nazi ones, beating up and arresting a number of them. The Boston Herald celebrated the police violence. This is what they said, I'm quoting them now. More than 150 policemen arrested 21 communists, and battered and bruised heads, bodies, and legs were counted by scores. Now, the anti-Nazi protesters were there to protest the official visit of the Karlsruhe, a battleship from Hitler's Navy that was moored at the nearby Charlestown Naval Yard. Despite Hitler's having come to power only in January 1933, the Nazis' attacks against trade unionists and the political left and their virulent anti-Semitism were already evident. Nevertheless, many in elite Boston circles had no problem with the ship, as shown by the Harvard students' presence, and media coverage of the Karlsruhe and its sailors was typically fawning. Again, let me go to the Herald, quoting the Herald now. Each member of the ship has this common denominator, an impeccable appearance, a knowledge of English, and a charming old world courtesy. They were, in short, a joy to the feminine heart, and made that poor fellow, the average American, seem a bit shabby by contrast. The culmination of this visit was a banquet on the same evening as the police riot, right? Nearly 1,000 people gathered. Among them were local German Americans, representatives of the city, and several veterans organizations. They assembled at the Back Bay's Copley Plaza Hotel. Most of you will be familiar with this, right across from the Boston Public Library and the Trinity Church. They were there to celebrate the Karlsruhe officers and sailors. Hanging above this posh gathering were the Nazi swastika flag, the Stars and Stripes, and the flag of Germany. According to the Boston Globe, the speakers, and I'm going to quote the Globe here, talked of friendly relations between the two countries, defended Germany's economic program, attacked the world boycott against Germany, and derided agitation against German American societies, and gave stiff-armed Nazi salutes. Right? The fact that few of us have heard of this speaks volumes. Now, just as people in Boston organized to oppose Nazi Germany and their local sympathizers in the 1930s and 40s, organizing across difference in terms of class, race, and gender and sexuality was an important part of what was going on in Boston in the late 60s and 1970s. Right? This is not to ignore racialized conflicts that plagued Boston during this period. We have a number of sites associated with such conflict, particularly around busing. Right? One of those sites that we have in the book is Carson Beach in South Boston, which is very close to the border with Dorchester. At Carson Beach, the largely African-American residents of the Columbia Point Housing Project, which is just across the bay, had to assert their right to access what was and is public space, but it had been effectively been defined as a space for whites only. Right? But there was more going on, of course, in Boston. And one example was the founding of the Black Panther Party, the Boston chapter of the Black Panther Party in mid-1968. Many of its founders were Boston-born students at Northeastern University. While the Panthers originally focused on fighting police brutality, its activities were much broader, growing out of a politics that was revolutionary, socialist, and third worldist in orientation. The Boston chapter, for example, worked in coalition with Students for Democratic Society and local efforts to boycott grapes, which was part of the work of the United Farm Workers. Right? It was also heavily involved in efforts in the Boston area to end or challenge the US war in Vietnam. Its most important activity, however, was the Franklin Lynch People's Free Health Center, right, which was located at Tremont and Ruggles Street in Roxbury. It reflected the Panthers' insistence on completely free government-provided health care, right, in terms of both prevention and treatment. Now, in terms of the clinic's name, Franklin Lynch was an African-American man who had moved to Boston in the mid-1960s from New Jersey. By all accounts, he was a very talented soul singer. He was also someone who struggled with mental illness, which contributed to an injury he sustained that landed him in a ward at Boston City Hospital in March 1970. A Boston police officer by the name of Walter Duggan was present in the ward when Franklin got into a confrontation with another patient. Duggan then pulled out his gun, right? Lynch had a towel in his hand and he took a swipe at the gun that Duggan was holding. Duggan then raised his gun and fired it 5 times, killing Franklin Lynch, who was only 24 years old at the time. In 1973, an all-white jury found Duggan not responsible for Lynch's death. Now, I don't know if any of you saw this, but just about a week or two ago, Boston Magazine ran an excellent article looking back at the killing and its aftermath 50 years later. In the article, the authors, Kali Carioli and Eli Reed, call the shooting and what happened in its aftermath, quote, a parable about the insidious resilience of institutional racism in Boston. I highly recommend reading this article. The Boston chapter of the Black Panther Party opened the Franklin Lynch People's Free Health Center a few months after the killing, on May 31st, 1970. A trailer served at the clinic's home. It was sited on vacant land that the Panthers and the Black United Front, which had played a key role in protesting the killing of Franklin Lynch. They had occupied this land to block the planned construction of a highway, and that is today the site of the Southwest Corridor Park. Medical professionals, black and white, volunteered their labor at the clinic, as did many lay medical individuals. The clinic, which eventually offered 24-hour service, provided checkups, immunizations, gynecological services, pregnancy tests and blood tests, and free sickle cell anemia testing. Today, the headquarters of the Boston Police Department sit on this site. The war in Vietnam, of course, was central to left and progressive activism in the area during the 60s and 70s. But again, there was a great diversity of activity going on, not least in East Boston, home to Logan Airport. Logan Airport now makes up 2/3 of East Boston's land. That's really incredible to think about, 2/3 of East Boston's land. Due to its eating up more and more of the neighborhood's land, including residential areas and public parks, and all the pollution associated with the airport's operation, Logan was a frequent target of neighborhood protests during the 60s and 70s. These protests often involved a multi-racial group of residents from Cambridge, Jamaica Plain, Mattapan, Roxbury, and the South End. They were members of what was called the Greater Boston Committee on the Transportation Crisis, an alliance of community-based groups fighting the proposed Southwest Expressway, in addition to airport expansion. Logan is a major contributor to climate breakdown, which Suren was talking about at the beginning. Flights from Logan alone are responsible for millions of metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions each year, more than the total annual emissions of all activities generated by a number of the world's lowest income countries, such as Haiti, for example, or Niger. Curiously, however, if you look at the city of Boston's reports that focus on climate change, they say almost nothing about the airport. In fact, the city does not include Logan's flights as part of its measurements of Boston's carbon footprint. Were they to do so, it would become clear that cutting CO2 emissions necessitates a radical downsizing of Logan. Now, let me quickly mention two other important activist formations that emerged in Boston during the 70s, not least because they speak to present day concerns and struggles. In 1974, on Moultrie Street in Dorchester, this is near Shawmut Station on the Red Line, a group of Black women activists, each with long histories in the anti-war, feminist, and Black liberation movements, began meeting and founding what became known as the Kombahi River Collective. Considering matters of gender, class, race, and sexual orientation, they developed a theory of liberation that's proved to be very influential both in academia and among social justice organizers, one based on the notion that oppression unfolds and is to be challenged on intersecting fronts. Accordingly, members of the collective work with Black men in the fight against racism, with white women in the struggle against male domination. They also define themselves as socialists, aiming to overthrow capitalism. Among their better known activist work were demonstrations aimed at calling attention to a series of murders and violent attacks against Black women that were going uninvestigated by the Boston Police Department. Finally, let me mention something on Bromfield Street in the downtown area. This was the longtime home of Gay Community News. This is right behind the Marlborough Street Church Chapel that Suren shared with us earlier. Gay Community News was founded in 1973 as a local newsletter, and it soon became a national weekly newspaper. The newspaper played a key role in uniting local and regional organizations into a national movement for gay liberation. It was widely considered the most progressive of national gay and lesbian newspapers. The content of the newspaper reflected the much broader political concerns of its collective members. So they covered things like police brutality and nuclear disarmament, as well as racism and US intervention in Central America. As such, many in progressive and left political circles outside of the lesbian and gay community were regular readers. Now, before moving to questions and discussion, let me make just a few quick comments. Right? Trying to capture a place as diverse and dynamic as Boston is highly challenging. Right? In that regard, we want to make clear that our goal in the book is not to be comprehensive. Rather, our goal is to be suggestive, to paint a suggestive portrait of an area that highlights that, in a manner that highlights its long contested manner. In many ways, we merely scratch the region's surface, or its many surfaces, given the multiple layers that it embodies. Second thing I want to say is that we, the authors of the book, appreciate we're not the first ones to write about Boston from a people's perspective and the world of which it is part. Nor we hope will we be the last. We see the book as a small contribution to a much larger discussion, one we are sure will continue. In that regard, if you have a chance to read the book, we welcome your feedback. We also invite you to visit us at our webpage, right, which will publish new entries and the dozens of entries that we couldn't squeeze into the book. And we invite you to follow us on Facebook. Finally, there are many people we want to thank, far too many to mention now, so we encourage you to look at our acknowledgements. That said, we do want to express our gratitude to the Massachusetts Historical Society, a really important community institution, for hosting this event. I want to thank it for its valuable work more broadly. I want to thank you all for attending. Special thanks to Catherine Alger for opening the event, to Gavin Cleespies for introducing us, and to Sarah Bertulli for inviting us and organizing tonight's event. So we're now happy to take questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you for a fabulous preview of your book. We have some questions that people have typed in. I would just like to let audience members know that if they would like to ask a question, we would ask you to use the Q&A function, which if you're using a Mac or a PC is at the bottom of your screen. And we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. So we had one question, which was, what are a couple examples of sites that you really wanted to include but weren't able to actually get into the book? Was there a couple that just were right at the edge but didn't quite make it in? Joe, do you want
Oh, Suren, you want to take that?
Yeah, I'll take it. Sure.
to?
I'm sure Eleni and Joe will have other lists other than mine as well. Of course, we had to make tough decisions. I'll just talk about one that sort of springs to mind right now. One of the things we had hoped to do was capture Boston's intellectual history. And so there were sites where important debates happened. One of them on the Harvard campus was between the economist Schumpeter, Joseph Schumpeter, and Paul Sweezy, who would go on to found an important magazine called Monthly Review, the first issue of which featured an essay by Albert Einstein. And they had a debate about the future of capitalism right in the middle of World War II. And we thought that that might be an interesting story to include. And in the end, it was one of the stories we left out. Nonetheless, we were able to address many different episodes in intellectual history, including the locations like where Science for the People was founded, Dollars and Cents magazine, Sojourners, and a number of other journals as well. So on the intellectual history front, that was certainly my favorite site that I would have liked to have included. Joe and Eleni, I'm sure you have others too that you'd wanted to have included.
Well, rather than mention a site, I'll just mention a municipality that we didn't include. And this was a tough decision that we had to make. We didn't include Brookline, right? And there are a number of sites that we wrote about and we could have included in the book, but ultimately, again, we had to make hard decisions. We were only allowed 100,000 words in addition to dozens of photos. And so we had to, always when you're writing a book, it's in some ways harder to figure out what not to include as it is to figure out what to include. And so the Brookline related sites in addition to the site that Suren just mentioned on the Harvard campus are things that we're going to put on the website.
It's always hard in the moment to remember specific entries. But one that, I researched at the very, very beginning of my part of this project was the Bussey Bridge, which was it's not I don't think a well-known story, but in the 1880s, there was a train that left Roslindale Station and there were about, I think, 200, 300 people on board. And the bridge gave way and a lot of people died and a lot of people were injured. And as a result, there were a lot of regulations that happened nationwide for railroad safety. Not something that I think about very often because trains are relatively safe these days, but something that happened in this neighborhood where Roslindale, a residential neighborhood, had impacts across the country. So that's one that I always think about. It's not one we were able to include, but like Joe said, we'll try to include all of these on our site.
Actually, the Bussey Bridge was featured in a walking tour that we did a number of years ago. So
great.
Halloween weird and worrisome tour. So it was spooky things in Boston, or horrible sights in Boston. But so Alex wrote, how did organizers publicize protests 100 years ago, such as the one at Fenway Park, so that they were able to achieve such great turnout? I don't know if one of you want to take a shot at that.
Okay. All three of us are in our own ways activists, and getting access to the media and writing about the issues that concern us has always been a challenge, especially in the way we'd like to project it. I don't know the specifics around the 1919 mobilization. However, I would suggest that something that would be really important to understand in order to produce that scale of mobilization were the Irish community organizations that were able to shift power in City Hall from the Brahmins to the Irish community. So I think that there were lots of face-to-face organization. There was a lot of face-to-face organization. I can imagine the various parishes mobilizing in their churches to turn out people. So I don't know exactly how the turnout occurred for that 1919 action. Maybe Joe and Eleni could add to what I've had to say.
No, I don't know. I would just reinforce what you said. I mean, there's the importance of local institutions, right? People's propensity to interact in very direct ways was far more, I mean, this is obviously prior to the time of social media, right? I mean, to the extent there was social media, it was like graffiti on bathroom walls, right? But there were community institutions like Hibernian Hall, which still exists on Dudley Street in Roxbury, which was a central institution for the Irish community. So I would imagine it would have been sites like that, right? In addition to churches and bars and things like that, that played key roles in helping to mobilize the Irish community, at least in 1919. But similar sets of institutions, across the city in the greater Boston region, right? Given the broad mobilizations that took place.
There's another dimension to this that might be worth mentioning given our current context. 1919 comes right after the Spanish flu, where large gatherings were eventually, over the resistance of the Catholic Church, these large gatherings were prohibited. And so this might have also been among the first large gatherings after the Spanish flu.
Yeah, I would imagine it would have been. So Michelle wrote in, one of your slides showed Phyllis Wheatley, but I didn't hear any comment about her. Can you provide info about that? I believe that's a monument on Commonwealth Ave.
Yeah. Certainly, we tell the story of Phyllis Wheatley's arrival in Boston and the conditions of her enslavement. One of the interesting things about the site that we chose was where the ship, the Phyllis, docked, and in order to locate it, we worked through a number of different sources, and eventually came to realize it was at the actual location where the Boston Tea Party would take place a little later on. And so to find that actual location meant moving a little bit away from the official Boston Tea Party site to a site more inland today. I mean, I could go into the Phyllis Wheatley story, which I think is generally quite well known. One dimension to Phyllis Wheatley that's less well known was her broad opposition to slavery. She was often seen as somebody who was very closely linked to the powers that be, given that certifying her poetry as having been written by her was a task accomplished by the elites within Massachusetts. However, more recent historiography suggests that her opposition to slavery, tied to British-linked elites, meant that after independence, Phyllis Wheatley's star sort of declined in the United States, helping explain her trajectory and eventual death in poverty.
Thank you. So there's a comment that's not actually a question, but I thought that it might be worth including. Maida, I may be mispronouncing that, but said, thank you for including gay community news. When you mentioned that hotel, I was all geared up to make sure you knew of it. I'm in that photo holding the banner. So
that's great.
World.
Yes.
But James wrote a question, essentially saying, what was your training in doing research? Could you speak to your methods and what types of sources you were using to develop this?
Eleni, maybe you should take that.
Yeah.
So we started working on this 6 years ago. Joe and Suren were the solid team of two, and I joined along a few months later, and we started working really on a process of discovery first. We were trying to learn as much as we could. We all had ideas about what we knew, but we really didn't know what we didn't know. So we spoke with many activists, we spoke with archivists, we did a lot of research from books, we did research in documents, we read a lot of old newspaper articles, we read all sorts of documents. And we really relied on the community, I would say. There were a lot of, oh, well, you're interested in this, you should talk to this next person, or this person's really the expert on X, Y, and Z. This is who you need to talk to if you're interested in understanding the history of Roslindale or the history of Brighton. And as the book suggests, it's very much a ground up process. The person who's the expert in Cambridge is not the expert in Dorchester. And so we really relied on people's interest and curiosity, and people came back to us after thinking about how they imagined a people's history of Boston and of Greater Boston. It was not a one and done, one conversation and we had all the 160 sites. It was very much a process. We used, as I think the person wrote in their question, we used the Boston Public Library a lot. We also used organizations like the Massachusetts Historical Society. We used local historical societies. I think we actually worked with Gavin when he was at the Cambridge Historical Society. Or maybe the other Cambridge one. I always get them confused. But all that to say, we relied on a lot of people. We're not the experts at all on any of this, and so we were learning right alongside everyone else. I did a lot of work on the photo aspect of this project, and that was also a huge project on working with these various archives, both the Boston City Archives. We worked with the BPDA archives. We worked with various universities who had these incredible collections of photos. There's some private collections the Boston Public Library owns of photographers who seem to have been everywhere all at once in a period of 50 years. Every event that we wanted to find, we found the picture from this one photographer or this other photographer. So I don't know if Joe and Suren want to talk about this, but the process really was an enjoyable one. It was very much one of a discovery. We walked a lot, we biked a lot, saw things that we didn't know about, and here we are.
I would just add, there was a lot of serendipity involved in this process. So as Eleni was saying, we wandered a lot, right? We walked around, we biked, we got on public transportation, just went places. And I remember once Suren, I think it was Suren and I, we were in South Boston. We had gone to, on West Broadway, we had gone to the South Boston courthouse because we knew that a very important anti-draft protest had taken place there in the 1960s. It resulted in a US Supreme Court decision, right? And while we were there, some person from the neighborhood walked by and was asking us what we were doing, why we were interested in the building in a very friendly way. And he mentioned that was originally the site of the Perkins School for the Blind, right? That Helen Keller, who we're all familiar with, but we're probably not familiar with the fact that she was a very well-known and radical political activist, right? Very much active on the front of suffrage, on pacifism, on socialism. So here's this important anti-war event that took place in the 1960s. It's also the place where Helen Keller had gone to school, and in some ways her spirit was animating what took place in the 1960s, probably unknown to the people that were there in the 1960s, but we wouldn't have found that out had we not gone there and just happened to run into this person.
Yeah, I can say working in public history, a lot of the time it's just good luck bumping into a person who maybe knows the story or maybe knows somebody who knows the story better. And I don't know if you worked with me at the Cambridge Historical Society, but I will say that one of my personal proud moments for the work at the Cambridge Historical Society was that we amassed the only complete collection of the Old Mole newspaper. So it's the only one in existence. And
that's one of our sites in the book, right? So it's great. It's great.
Yeah, that one actually has another serendipitous story. I went to the Middle East to see if I could learn more about the site, because that's where it was, in Central Square. And someone brought me to the back and showed me these photos on the wall of where the entrance to the Old Mole was. So.
Great. So thank you very much. I want to thank all of our guests and just let Catherine say a word if she'd like to.
I just wanted to say thank you as well. I'm going to speak for the entire audience to say that we're looking at our city with new eyes. Thank you.
I hope people enjoyed it. As always, we recommend that you consider supporting a locally owned bookstore to purchase a copy. This is the link to the Porter Square Books, who does not give us any support for doing this. We're just trying to find a local bookstore to support. And of course, if you enjoy this program and would like to continue to see programs like this, we hope you will also support the Mass Historical Society. So without further ado, have a good evening. And I hope you have a good chance to buy this book and wander around and see some new sights. Thanks.